My wife, Sarah, and I have been together for 12 years, married for 8 of those. She was my high school sweetheart, my best friend, the one person I thought I knew inside and out. Back then, I saw her as this bright, lively woman who could make anyone laugh, even on the worst of days. We've had our ups and downs, but we always pulled through together. That's how I always thought it would be. Then, about 6 months ago, things changed. Money had been a little tight, and Sarah decided to pick up a job as a bartender at a nightclub downtown. Said it would help us with bills and give her something to do. Sarah's always had a way with people. She's social, great at making conversation, so I figured it'd be a good fit. Plus, she seemed excited, and I was all for it. I thought she'd work a few shifts a week, make some extra cash, and that would be that. At first, that's exactly how it went. She'd get home around midnight, maybe 1 in the morning, talk about the regulars, and laugh about the wild stories from her night. I'd listen, happy that she seemed to be enjoying herself. But before long, her hours started stretching later. It wasn't just once or twice. It became every single night she worked. She'd come in at 2 a.m., sometimes 3, always claiming the same things. The place was packed, they were short-staffed, they needed her to stay late. I tried to brush off my worries. I'd tell myself, it's just a few extra hours. She's working hard. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. But it wasn't just the hours. Little things started changing. Every night, she'd come home and head straight for the shower, something she'd never done before. She seemed to avoid talking to me, always giving short, almost rehearsed answers about her night. If I asked how work was, she'd brush me off with, "Oh, it was fine. Same as always." She seemed distracted, almost as if her mind was somewhere else. I'd wait for her to look at me, to say something real, but it was like she was empty. The warmth, the laughter that used to fill our home just felt gone. I started noticing other changes too. Suddenly, Sarah was dressing differently. She'd buy these new outfits, flashier, tighter, things I'd never seen her wear before. When I asked her about it, she said it was for work, that she needed to look professional. But these weren't professional clothes. They were eye-catching, clothes designed to turn heads. She'd spend an hour on her makeup and hair, going out the door looking like she was headed for a night out, not a bartending shift. And yet, whenever I brought it up, she'd laugh and tell me I was being paranoid, that I needed to stop being so old-fashioned. Her tone was dismissive, as if I had no right to ask. Then came the nights she wasn't working. It started slowly, an occasional night out, then 2, and before I knew it, she was going out every other night, always with some vague story. She'd say she was meeting the girls, but I never heard names. Never knew where they were going or when she'd be back. And when I tried to ask, she'd get defensive, almost angry. "I'm not a kid, Matt," she'd say, her voice cold. "I don't have to give you a report every time I leave the house." Her attitude was so different from the Sarah I knew. The sweet, caring woman I'd married was replaced by someone I barely recognized. One Saturday night, it all came to a head. She was supposed to come straight home after her shift, but by 1 a.m., she still wasn't back. I stayed up, watching the clock, waiting for the sound of her car in the driveway. But 1 a.m. turned into 2, and still nothing. I called her, texted her, but got no answer. By 3 a.m., I was pacing, feeling a mix of worry and anger that I couldn't shake. I thought maybe she'd had car trouble or some emergency, but I had no idea where she was. Finally, at almost 4 a.m., she walked through the door. She looked startled to see me waiting up, and without a word, she headed straight to the shower. When she came out, I was still there, waiting. "Late night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She gave me a look, almost annoyed, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. "Why are you still up?" she asked, her tone dismissive. "I told you I'd be late." I told her I'd been worried, that I'd try to call. She shrugged, brushing past me as if it didn't matter. "I was busy," she said flatly. "It's just a job, Matt. You don't need to check in on me every 5 minutes." Her tone threw me. This wasn't the Sarah I'd known. I asked her why she hadn't answered her phone, and she just stared at me, almost as if daring me to press further. "It's my life, Matt," she said. "You don't own me. Stop acting so controlling." And then she just walked off, leaving me standing there, feeling like I'd been punched. The next day, she acted as if nothing had happened. When I brought it up, She laughed it off, saying I must have imagined things. But I hadn't. I remembered every detail, every second of that night, and I knew something was wrong. For the first time in our marriage, I felt a cold distance between us. Like there was a wall I couldn't break through. Over the next week, I kept an eye on things, paying closer attention to her patterns. She seemed more secretive, coming and going without so much as a word. There were more late nights, more vague explanations. She'd rush out to run errands at odd hours, and every time I asked, she'd just snap back with some excuse, telling me to mind my own business. Her nights out with the so-called girls became a regular thing, even on days when she didn't have a shift. She'd come home smelling of expensive perfume, with the makeup still fresh on her face, and act as if nothing was wrong. I didn't want to admit it, but every instinct I had was telling me something was off. The laughter, the warmth we used to share was gone, replaced by a cold, guarded stranger who seemed to have little interest in our life together. I told myself I was overthinking, that maybe she was just going through a phase. But deep down, I knew better. There was a pattern here, a series of little lies and secrets that I couldn't ignore. Then one night she was out again. I couldn't sleep, so I started pacing, trying to figure out what to do. Every scenario ran through my mind, each one worse than the last. I didn't want to be the guy who doubted his wife. I didn't want to be the husband who couldn't trust. But the signs were there, right in front of me, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. That's when I decided. I needed answers. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just sit there in the dark, waiting for things to fix themselves. I knew something wasn't right. This was the woman I'd spent over a decade with, the one I trusted more than anyone else. And yet, the more I thought about those late nights, her cold, dismissive tone, the expensive new clothes, the perfume that lingered on her when she got home, the less I felt I knew her. It was like waking up one day to realize a stranger was living in your home, sitting across from you at the dinner table, sleeping in your bed. I was living with someone who wore my wife's face, but acted nothing like the woman I married. One night, Sarah was out again, another girl's night. She'd thrown on her new dress, put on that heavy, sweet-smelling perfume, and barely looked at me as she left. Something about the way she walked out that door, so carefree, so detached, made me decide then and there that I needed to know the truth. This wasn't just about a late night here and there. This was something bigger, something she didn't want me to see. I noticed recently that she had a habit of keeping things hidden away in the back of our closet. Maybe she thought I'd never look there, or maybe she didn't care. But after she left, I went to that closet, feeling like a fool, my heart pounding as I sifted through our things. And that's when I found it, a small, nondescript envelope tucked beneath some old clothes. It looked like nothing special at first, just a bit of paper. But when I opened it, my hands went cold. Inside was a thick stack of cash, and on top of it a crumpled hotel receipt. The date on the receipt was only a week old, from a high-end hotel across town. I stood there staring at that receipt, trying to come up with some reasonable explanation. Maybe she had gone there with friends for a night out. Maybe it was a gift from the club for working extra shifts. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I couldn't picture any version of Sarah that would be staying in a hotel on a work night. And if she'd been going out with friends, she'd have told me, wouldn't she? The cash was another question entirely. I knew how much she made from tips. She always left them out in a jar by the kitchen. This was different. This was far more than what she'd make in a night, or even a week at the bar. The idea of her hiding it, stuffing it away like a secret, felt like a punch in the gut. I could have asked her about it, but a part of me didn't want to give her the chance to lie again. I'd watch her dodge my questions and brush me off too many times already. After a few minutes, I put everything back where I'd found it, my mind reeling. If she was hiding this, what else wasn't I seeing? What else was she capable of keeping from me? I tried to push it all down, to pretend it wasn't what it looked like, but that receipt kept flashing in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the date, the name of that hotel, the neatly printed amount. My gut told me it was time to take off the blinders. The following day, I couldn't focus on anything. I spent most of it going over every conversation, every moment from the past few months, searching for clues, trying to piece together where it all went wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only scratching the surface. There had to be more, and I was determined to find it. That night, She was out again, claiming she had an extra shift to cover, and I couldn't resist anymore. I had to know. So, without a second thought, I got in my car and drove to her workplace, pulling into a spot across the street. It was a quiet night, and the club looked like it usually did, with a few people milling around outside. I waited, thinking I'd see her through the windows, working the bar, chatting with customers, maybe even doing a little extra work to prove me wrong. But an hour passed, and there was no sign of her. No glimpse, no sighting, nothing. After another hour of waiting, I felt ridiculous sitting there like some paranoid fool. I told myself I should just drive home, that maybe she'd come home later with some perfectly reasonable excuse. But my gut wouldn't let it go. So, I took a breath and went inside. The place was busy, loud music, flashing lights, people everywhere. I scanned the bar, the tables, looking for her. But she wasn't there. I asked one of the bartenders if he'd seen her, and he looked at me like I had 3 heads. "Sarah? She's not working tonight," he said before getting pulled away by a group of customers. I walked out of there feeling like I'd been punched. She'd lied, right to my face, without so much as a second thought. And if she wasn't working, then where was she? Every excuse she'd given me, every late shift or extra hours, flashed through my mind. Had she been lying to me all along? Was every late night, every excuse, just some cover for something or someone else? The drive home was a blur. I tried to piece things together, try to make sense of why she'd lie like this, but I was coming up empty. All I knew was that I couldn't keep pretending anymore. The woman I'd trusted, the one I'd thought I knew inside and out, was hiding things, lying straight to my face, and acting like I was the one with the problem. That night, I barely slept. My mind wouldn't let me rest. The image of that envelope with the cash and the hotel receipt replayed in my head like a broken record. The questions churned through me. Was this the first time? Was this some kind of regular thing? Was I just a fool who'd been ignoring the signs? Every instinct I had was screaming at me, telling me to wake up, to see what was right in front of me. The next morning, she acted like everything was normal, smiling, laughing, going through her routine as if the world was perfectly fine. I watched her, studied her every move, looking for some hint, some crack in the facade. But she was smooth, practiced. She looked me in the eye, even joked about her late shift and how exhausting it was. It was almost as if she'd convinced herself that the lies were real. But I wasn't convinced. Not anymore. I knew there was more to this than she was letting on. I knew that whatever Sarah was hiding, it went deeper than just a few late nights. And I was done sitting around waiting for answers that would never come. It was then that I realized I needed a plan. Over the next few days, I kept my suspicions to myself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever Sarah was hiding, it wasn't small. I wasn't dealing with the woman I thought I'd married. I was dealing with someone who seemed to be living a whole different life. And I was just the guy on the sidelines, clueless, watching her walk out the door night after night. It felt like I was a stranger in my own home. She'd breeze through the house, laughing about things that never involved me, talking about people I'd never met, dressing up and heading out as if she had somewhere important to be. And every night, she'd come back with nothing but vague stories, cold shoulders, and the same dismissive attitude. But I could feel it. The lies, the secrets, the distance growing between us like a canyon I couldn't cross. I'd almost reached my breaking point when I stumbled on something unexpected. I'd taken to keeping an eye on her things, not snooping exactly, but just looking out for anything that felt out of place. I thought I knew what I was looking for, a receipt, a note, something that confirmed my fears. But instead, I found something far stranger. It was a stack of letters hidden in the back of her drawer, behind a few old books, and something she clearly didn't think I'd ever notice. The envelopes looked new, addressed to a man named Rob Parker. The letters were handwritten, filled with words I never expected to see from Sarah's hand. I pulled out the first one, my hands shaking as I unfolded it, reading through the neat handwriting that looked too precise, too careful to belong to the woman I thought I knew. Each letter was like a gut punch. They weren't love letters exactly, but there was something in the way she wrote, an intimate familiarity that shook me to my core. She mentioned meeting him in secret, talked about the arrangement they'd made, and said how grateful she was for his support. It was as if I'd stepped into some alternate reality where Sarah had this whole hidden world she was living, one that I'd never been invited into. But then came the twist. I reached the final letter and found a folded contract paper clipped to it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was a detailed agreement between Sarah and this Rob Parker, a man I'd never heard of in my life. The contract laid out terms, mentioning things like compensation for services, hotel stays, and privacy guarantees. My stomach twisted as I took in the words. It was a cold, businesslike document, yet it was clear as day. She was meeting him for money, arrangements that happened on nights I thought she was working or out with friends. This wasn't some casual affair or a momentary lapse of judgment. This was organized, thought out. She was living a double life right under my nose like some character out of a crime drama, and I'd been too blind to see it. Then a thought hit me like a freight train. What if Rob Parker wasn't the only one? I felt sick. For all I knew, there were more of these arrangements. More hidden deals, more secret contracts buried in places I'd never think to look. I felt as if I'd been hit with a truth too heavy to bear. That my wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted, had been selling herself for money, as if our marriage was just a sideline in her life. And I had been the fool who never saw it coming. By the time Sarah got home that night, I was beyond shaken. But I held it together, acting like everything was fine. I didn't let on that I'd found the letters or the contract. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do. Blowing up at her now, while satisfying, wouldn't get me the answers I needed. If anything, she'd probably find a way to twist it around, to make me feel like I was the one at fault. That's how good she'd gotten at lying. I decided to take a different approach. I told her I'd be out of town for a few days on a last-minute work trip. An old friend had mentioned a property that needed some work, and I played it off like it was an opportunity too good to pass up. She seemed relieved, barely glancing up from her phone as I packed a small bag. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer to help, didn't even look up as I left. It was as if my absence was a relief for her. Once I was out the door, I didn't go far. Instead, I checked into a small hotel across town, not even 20 minutes from our house. I needed to see what she did when she thought I was gone, how she acted when she thought she had the house to herself. And sure enough, the moment she thought I was out of town, she slipped into her routine. No text messages, no check-ins, just silence. The first night I waited, trying to catch my breath, trying to come to terms with the fact that I was staking out my own wife. Around midnight, I drove back to the house, parking down the street where she wouldn't notice me. I watched the house, waiting to see if anything would happen, if anyone would come by. Sure enough, just past 1 in the morning, a sleek black car pulled up to our driveway. A man I'd never seen before stepped out. He was dressed sharply, too sharply for someone just coming by for a casual visit. My chest tightened as I watched him walk to the door, his movements smooth, like he'd done this before. I could barely breathe as I saw her open the door, letting him in with a smile that was a little too warm, a little too familiar. I stayed out there, watching as the lights in the living room dimmed, my mind racing. I didn't know who this man was, if he was Rob Parker or another one of her secret clients. All I knew was that I couldn't go in there, couldn't storm in demanding answers. Not yet. If I did, she'd find a way to spin it, to slip through my fingers like she always did. No, I needed more proof, more ammunition for when I finally decided to confront her. So I waited, sitting in my car as the minutes ticked by, the image of Sarah with this stranger burning into my mind. It was the longest, most surreal night of my life, watching the home we'd built together become a stage for her lies, a place where she led a life that had nothing to do with me. Around 3 in the morning, the man finally left. He walked out of the house like he didn't have a care in the world, like he'd just finished some casual business meeting. He got in his car, drove off without so much as a backward glance, leaving me sitting there in the dark, wondering how long I'd been played. As I sat there, watching the empty driveway, I felt the anger inside me shift, turn into something colder, more deliberate. This wasn't just some mistake she'd made. This was an entire operation she'd been running behind my back. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I drove back to the hotel, my mind racing with plans. I knew now that a simple confrontation wasn't enough. She needed to face the full weight of her betrayal. I wanted her to feel it, to lose everything she'd built on the lies she'd fed me. And I knew exactly how to do it. The next morning, I lay in the stiff hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, mind racing with what I'd seen the night before. The stranger in the sleek car, the dimmed lights in the living room, the casual way he'd strolled out in the early hours. It all played back in my head, stoking a cold, simmering anger. Sarah had turned our home into the stage for her double life, all while I'd been nothing more than an unsuspecting extra in the background. I spent that day keeping a low profile, pacing the small hotel room and weighing my options. I knew I couldn't just storm in and throw everything at her. I needed her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. But I couldn't let her slip away, find a way to spin this as my fault, or bury her actions under a mountain of excuses. I knew Sarah well enough to know she'd try. She'd always been good at finding a way to dodge accountability. After hours of running through scenarios, I settled on a plan. First, I needed to gather every shred of proof I could find. I needed undeniable, unbreakable evidence, not just for me, but for her family, her friends, everyone who knew her. I wanted them to see what she'd been hiding. This was going to be a full, calculated takedown, one that left no room for her to explain her way out. I started with the basics. I went through old emails we'd shared, hoping to find any clue about these arrangements or connections she might have mentioned in passing. But she'd been careful, keeping her double life out of our regular communications. It was as if she'd compartmentalized her world into two distinct realities, one that she shared with me and another where I didn't even exist. The cold realization hit me that this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. This life, these secrets, they had been crafted with intent. That evening, I decided to return to the house. I didn't plan on confronting her yet, but I wanted to see if anything else would slip through her carefully crafted facade. I parked around the block again, walking the short distance to our home. Through the window, I could see her inside, moving around with that casual, comfortable air she'd adopted lately, like nothing in the world was wrong. The woman in there wasn't my Sarah. She was someone I didn't recognize. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the front door quietly and stepped inside. She heard me almost immediately, her head snapping up in surprise. "Oh, Matt," she said, clearly startled. "I thought you were out of town." I shrugged, trying to keep my voice calm. "Plans changed. Thought I'd surprise you." She gave a tight smile, eyes darting around as if she were calculating what to say next. "Well, you could have told me," she said, a faint edge of irritation in her voice. "Would have been nice to know." I shrugged it off, moving past her and sitting on the couch, acting as if everything was normal. "Thought you'd appreciate a little surprise. Anything you want to tell me about while I was gone?" I asked, watching her carefully. She hesitated, just for a second, then shook her head. "Nothing really. Just work and, the usual." There it was. She didn't even flinch as she looked me in the eye and fed me lie after lie. But instead of anger, I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. She wasn't going to admit to anything. She wasn't going to crack. She decided to live this lie down to the last detail, no matter how much she had to twist reality to keep her secret life intact. I sat there, nodding along to her every word, as if I believed her. I asked about her girls' nights, her extra shifts, even her new work friends. And she had answers for all of it, spinning her stories with a smoothness that almost made me doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes. But the more she talked, the more I could see it. This woman wasn't the Sarah I'd married. She was someone who'd buried her old self under layers of deceit. Someone who didn't even blink at the lies she fed me. As I sat there, pretending to listen, I made my decision. I couldn't stand another night in that house, pretending everything was fine. I told her I had some last-minute errands to run and left, barely holding back the disgust churning inside me. I returned to the hotel, my anger sharpening with each passing minute. I wasn't going to let this go quietly. If she wanted to lead a life of secrets, then I'd expose those secrets to everyone who mattered. She'd spent months building this twisted world behind my back, and I was going to dismantle it brick by brick. The next step was clear. I'd confront her employers. The contract I'd found mentioned privacy guarantees, which likely meant her side jobs were something they knew about, or maybe even facilitated. If they were covering for her, then I'd take them down too. I wanted her entire world to feel the impact of what she'd done. That night, I began writing a detailed letter addressed to her manager, laying out everything I'd discovered, from the hidden cash to the hotel receipts. I attached copies of the letters I'd found, letting the facts speak for themselves. If her boss knew about her side arrangements, he wouldn't be able to ignore this. And if he didn't know, he'd find out soon enough what kind of employee he'd hired. But as I finished writing the letter, a thought hit me, a twist I hadn't anticipated. In all my focus on her job and her lies, I'd overlooked one crucial detail: her family. Sarah's parents and siblings adored her. To them, she was the golden child, the successful daughter with a perfect life. They had no idea of the things she'd been hiding. In their eyes, she could do no wrong. And suddenly, I knew how to complete this plan. I'd send copies of the same letter to her family, her parents, her siblings, even her closest friends. I'd let them see every detail of the person she'd become, the life she'd chosen to live behind their backs. She wouldn't just lose her job. She'd lose her family's trust, her friends' respect, her entire support network. The thought of it sent a dark satisfaction through me. She'd chosen to break our trust, our life, and now she'd face the fallout from everyone who'd ever trusted her. The next morning, I put everything in motion. I made copies of the documents, addressed the envelopes, and sent them to everyone in her life who mattered. Her boss, her parents, her siblings. They'd all receive the same letter, the same undeniable proof of who she'd become. As I sealed the last envelope, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control. She'd spent so long lying, spinning her stories, thinking she'd never face the consequences. But now, her world would unravel, and there'd be no hiding from it. When I returned to the house that evening, I acted as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with a smile, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. She'd chosen this path, chosen to betray our life together, and soon enough, she'd feel every ripple of the damage she'd caused. The days that followed were the calm before the storm, but I knew it wouldn't last. And as I waited, I could almost feel the cracks forming beneath her perfect facade, ready to shatter her world into pieces. 3 days later, the first wave of consequences arrived, and it was far more brutal than I had even imagined. I had spent those days going through the motions, holding it together every time Sarah and I crossed paths. She had no clue that her lies were inching toward the edge, about to fall apart. When I asked how her days were going, she'd reply in her usual breezy tone, eyes gleaming with that same old deceit. On the morning of the third day, she was still asleep when her phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand. It didn't stop. Then I heard the loud chime of our home phone, followed by a vibrating sound I recognized as her work phone. Calls, texts, missed messages, all piling up with an urgency that made it impossible to ignore. I watched her groggily reach over to silence her phone, only for it to ring again seconds later. "What the hell?" she muttered, picking it up, her tone irritated. I pretended to be asleep, but I watched her closely, one eye open, as she read the messages coming through. Her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion, and then her face drained of color. She got up, stumbled into the bathroom, and I could hear her muffled voice, making hasty calls and trying to explain herself. Her tone was anxious, each hello and yes, this is Sarah, getting softer, more desperate. I knew exactly what she was dealing with. Her family, her boss, her friends. They all had questions now. Questions she couldn't evade with a simple smile or a careless shrug. For a while, she stayed hidden in the bathroom, and I could only imagine her frantic efforts to put out the fires one by one. I felt a sense of cold satisfaction knowing her carefully constructed lies were being torn apart by the very people she'd fooled. Her golden reputation, the polished image she'd cultivated for years, was slipping through her fingers. The rest of that day was a strange blur of silence. Sarah was visibly shaken, glancing over at me with a look of confusion mixed with barely concealed dread. She hadn't confronted me yet. Perhaps she was still trying to piece it all together. By evening, I noticed she was holding her phone in a death grip, avoiding me as much as she could, staying glued to the couch and jumping every time her phone buzzed. Finally, when she couldn't take it anymore, she blurted out, Matt, something weird is going on. I acted surprised. What do you mean? She tried to sound calm, but her voice was shaky. I don't know who's been spreading rumors, but some people seem to think that I've been doing things I would never do. I looked at her, feigning shock. Rumors? What kind of rumors? Sarah's face tightened, clearly struggling to find a way to lie without tripping over her words. Someone's saying things about me at work. Really disgusting things. She paused, looking at me carefully, then said, Matt, you'd tell me if you'd heard anything, wouldn't you? I forced a sympathetic look. I haven't heard a thing. Are you sure someone's out to get you? It's just so out of character for you, Sarah. You've always been so loyal, honest, trustworthy. I could see her wince as I laid it on. She let out a nervous laugh, brushing off my words. I'll handle it. It's probably nothing. But she didn't look convinced. For the next few hours, she paced around, checking her phone, reading every new message with a grim expression. I stayed out of her way, watching her unravel in slow motion, each message chipping away at the facade she'd spent so long perfecting. By the end of the night, Sarah was barely holding it together. Her boss had called twice, and I overheard snippets of her frantic explanations, her strained attempts to cover her tracks. But she knew, just as well as I did, that the truth was out there now, spreading like wildfire. The family calls were the worst, though. I listened to her speak with her mother, her voice trembling, insisting it was all a mistake, a vicious lie. Her mother didn't sound convinced. Her brother called next, and she barely managed to hold back tears as he grilled her, asking why people were saying she'd been sneaking around behind my back, meeting men in secret, using her job as a cover. And all I had to do was sit back and watch her world crumble. The next morning, Sarah's boss called again, telling her to come into the office. She was on edge, pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath. She barely managed to look me in the eye as she told me she'd be back later. I knew this was the meeting that would decide everything, and it was clear she did too. Her polished reputation was a crucial part of her job, her way of standing out, of being valued. But now, with all the lies catching up to her, it would be hard for anyone to look at her the same way. When she returned that afternoon, I knew it hadn't gone well. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she held her purse tightly to her side. She barely said a word as she slumped onto the couch, staring blankly ahead, the weight of her choices settling around her. I decided it was finally time for the confrontation we both knew was coming. I sat down across from her, my voice calm as I broke the silence. Want to tell me what's really going on, Sarah? She looked up, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Matt, it's not what it looks like. People are just trying to ruin my reputation. None of it is true. I shook my head slowly, letting the silence fill the room before I spoke. Sarah, I know everything. The late nights, the hotels, the cash hidden in our closet. I found the letters, the contract. I know about the man who's been coming over when you think I'm not home. Her face went pale as I spoke, her lips parting in shock. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but no words came out. For once, she was completely caught off guard, unable to spin the story in her favor. Why, Sarah? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Why would you do this to us? To everything we've built? She stumbled over her words, her voice barely a whisper. Matt, it was just, I needed something different, something exciting. It was never supposed to mean anything. It's not like I loved anyone else. I shook my head, the anger boiling up inside me again. So that's your excuse? You didn't love them, so it doesn't matter? She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I thought you wouldn't find out. I thought I could keep it separate. I let out a hollow laugh. Separate? You turned our life into a lie, Sarah. You sold your dignity, your loyalty, and now you're trying to tell me you thought you could just keep it separate. She fell silent, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. She looked at me, the tears brimming in her eyes, but I felt nothing. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the person I'd loved, the person I'd trusted. She was someone else entirely, someone who'd chosen her own path and destroyed everything in the process. I stood up, my voice cold. It's over, Sarah. I want you out by the end of the week. And I hope you realize, now that your boss, your family, and everyone else knows the truth, you don't have much left to fall back on. Her face crumpled, the reality hitting her with full force. She tried to plead with me, to convince me to let her stay, but I'd made up my mind. The trust, the love, everything that had held us together was gone, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, I watched her pack her things, the silence between us a stark reminder of the life we'd once shared. She barely spoke, her head down, too ashamed to look at me. The final day she was there, she handed me her key, her eyes filled with regret, but it was too late for apologies. She walked out of the house, leaving me alone in the silence. And I knew then that I was finally free from the lies, the betrayal, the pain. Over the following months, I rebuilt my life piece by piece, reconnecting with friends and family, finding a new strength in my independence. Sarah's reputation had been shattered. Her social network crumbled. Her family barely spoke to her. Her friends distanced themselves, and her career was in tatters. She'd sacrificed everything for a series of secrets, and now she was paying the price. Looking back, I saw the betrayal for what it was, a painful, brutal lesson in trust and loyalty. I'd given her everything, and she'd chosen to throw it away. But in the end, I'd walked away stronger, with a life that was mine alone, free from her lies and deceit.